I started my first day of middle school. Now, until that point, I was always at the same school, and the year before, of course, was the greatest year of my life. I was the oldest, the wisest. I knew that school like the back of my hand. I knew the teachers, I knew the faculty. Everybody else was not only younger than me, but they were also smaller than me. I was, to put it lightly, a king, right? Then I started middle school, and it was obviously a huge change for me. Until that point, as I said, I felt like the ruler of my domain. And then I showed up for my very first day of middle school, and I was lost. Oh, not that lost. I was lost, right? I was the smallest. I was the youngest, the least experienced. I didn't know what I was doing. I'd shown up for one day before to kind of see where my classes were. So after my very first class, I get out of class, and I have my little sheet that says where my classes are, and I see where my next classroom is, and I can't remember where it's at, and I look up at the room numbers, and I'm trying to identify where I'm at, and I think I had a map, and I'm trying to figure out on the map where I am, and I can't figure it out. And the hallway's eventually empty, and I'm left there all by myself. And I was not only emotionally lost, but I was physically lost at that moment. And thankfully, some staff member came by, saw me that I was lost, and asked if they could help, and directed me off to my class. And I'm sure they'd probably done it with 10 or 15 other kids, because that was a very common thing. But man, that school was big. It was so much different than the school that I was used to. And then a very strange experience happened 2 days later. I realized that the school wasn't that big anymore. Now, a lot of people may look and see, oh, well, here's a guy that gets up and talks a lot, and he does a lot of things with Angular, and I know some people can look at me and feel like I've got some amazing amount of wisdom. I've never done anything embarrassing, had an embarrassing experience, like some kind of a Jedi Master. But no, I was truly lost. But then within a short amount of time, I realized that the school was actually laid out very logically. It was easy to find my way around. It really wasn't that much bigger than the school that I was used to. And in a short amount of time, even though I wasn't familiar with it, it was actually easy to understand. And I quickly became very comfortable and very familiar with my school. So directives are just like that. We are all familiar with directives in Angular 1, unless maybe we're a little bit newer to Angular. But for the most part, those of us who have been programming Angular for a while are very familiar with directives in Angular 1. But just like elementary school, we are soon going to be graduating off to Angular 2. And things are going to change a lot. So I want to talk today about the fact that if we understand directives in Angular 2, in Angular 1, it's going to help us when we get to Angular 2. And there's a few conceptual changes we need to have in our mind, or ideas we should have in our mind that will help us when moving to Angular 2. Now, I have to have the obligatory "this is me" picture, right, with my Twitter handle, and please don't follow me. Nothing I say is very interesting. But I like this picture of me a lot better. I feel like it's got a little bit more personality, but to be honest, I really feel like this is more me. And now that I've scarred you all for life, I work for Plural. I do work for Pluralsight, not as an employee. I'm a freelance author for Pluralsight. As you can see, it's a very respectable profession. But we're not here to talk about me. We're here to talk about directives. Well, we're here to talk about directives and components, right? So directives are the building blocks of our applications in Angular, right? They are how we build our applications. And we do this in Angular 1 right now. We use directives to build our applications. We put those directives together, and that's how we make big applications. We take small, simple pieces, and we make big applications out of them, right? So it's worth repeating that directives are the building blocks of our applications. I've had a very interesting experience when I was first learning Angular, when I was first learning Angular 1, and this was like way into my learning of Angular 1, like a year in, I finally realized that Angular 1 is just a whole bunch of directives put together. I don't know if anybody's read this. I know that they said this several times and it's on the documentation someplace, but the Angular is an HTML compiler. But I quickly learned that really, well, not quickly, it took me a little while, but when I finally realized Angular is actually a directive compiler, right? And if you haven't had this realization, this is very interesting. Here we have some code. HTML, ng app, we have to have this to start off, to kick off our Angular 1 apps, right? Well, what is this ng app? It's just a directive. This is not something magical that is anything different from what we build. This is the same kind of directive we would build ourselves. Angular runs off of directives. It doesn't just take the directives that you write and run. It itself is just a collection of directives. In Angular 1, we have types of directives. We have a certain number of kinds of directives, and nobody really talks about this very much. Igor kind of mentioned this yesterday in the Q&A panel in the morning, but there are exactly 3 types of directives we write in Angular, and everything that we write falls into one of these 3 categories. But we don't talk about this. The framework doesn't have this encoded into it anywhere, and so it's something that not everybody is necessarily familiar with, but this is kind of key to understanding how Angular 2 works, where it's going, and for us to learn to migrate our knowledge, not necessarily our applications, but potentially our applications, but at least our knowledge to Angular 2. So let's talk about those 3 types of directives. Type 1 is called, and these are terms that I didn't make up myself. These are terms that the Angular team actually uses internally, they just never talked about it. Type 1 is called components. Now, let me stress here, I'm talking about Angular 1, not Angular 2, okay? Type 1 is a component directive. Components have 2 key criteria, okay? They are represented by an element, and they have a template. If a directive that you write is represented by an element and has a template, it is a component directive, whether you realize it or not. Now, these are by far the most common types of directives that we as Angular developers write. Okay? So let's look at let's look at least one example here. A voting button widget, right? It's represented by an element. We're passing in some data to it. This is straightforward what we might write as our own directive. We write these all day long, left and right. Hopefully we do. If you compose your Angular 1 applications entirely out of controllers, it's time to start rethinking how you're doing your development. You should be composing them mostly out of these types of things, these reusable pieces of functionality so that we can drop them in wherever we want, and they work and they display. All these widgets, user display widgets, anything like that, these are component directives. Type 2 is called decorators, okay? A decorator is, the criteria for a decorator is that it is represented by an attribute and it has no template, okay? There's a third type which is going to be similar to this that I'll talk about in a minute. So let's talk specifically about decorators. Let's look at an example. Here we have the common ng-click directive, right? This is a decorator directive. What decorators do is they give new functionality to an existing DOM node, whether that DOM node is another directive itself or just a plain HTML DOM node. That's what a decorator does, is it gives new functionality. So whether that's the ability to listen to a click event or ng show and hide, right, where you can hide things, or ng controller, where you add a controller to the DOM node. That's what a decorator directive does, is it gives new functionality. Going back to our first example we looked at, ng-app, that is a decorator directive. It's giving new functionality to that DOM node. I'm sure that you've all, when you played around with it, encountered the scenario. You may not have ever encountered the scenario, but if you put ng-app on an inner DOM node, outside of that, nothing works. Same thing with the controller. It's only that DOM node and its children. The decorator actually applies to the DOM node. It's not some global universal thing. So these are the most common types of directives that we use, but as far as writing them ourselves, they're definitely less common. They're great for handling events. So here's an example that you might write. The HTML5 video element, there are no built-in directives to handle the events that happen on an HTML5 video element. So there's a paused event that the HTML5 video element that will raise. And if you want to trap that and listen to it and respond to that in your Angular application and call some function when it happens, like handle paused, for example, you would have to write your own directive, a decorator directive. So we do write these sometimes, but not very often. Let's just take a quick poll. How many people here in the last month have written a decorator directive? Okay, so look around. See how many people in the last month have written a component directive? Well, it wasn't significantly more, but I'm sure most people agree with me. We write component directives a lot more than we write decorator directives. So let's go on to the third type. This is, and here's a place where I'm going to stick in my own word. I like the word structural, so I threw that in. But the Angular team actually referred to them as template directives. They've had a couple of names that they've used, but this is by far the most common, is template directives. These directives are, the criteria for them are that they are represented by an attribute. They have no template, so just like decorators. But they use transclusion, and they somehow manipulate elements in the DOM, usually adding or removing elements. So there's two great examples of this. ng-repeat, which we're all very familiar with, and ng-if, okay? These are obviously commonly used because we use ng-repeat all the time. We might use ng-if now and then, but we use them all the time. But how often do we write them? Well, just about never. I did a bunch of research for a course that I wrote, and I was looking for business cases for writing your own structural directive. And I talked to a lot of people, searched a lot of places, and found one business case which was some caching. It was actually like a delay rendering variation on ng-if. But other than that, we don't need to manipulate the DOM, because apparently ng-if and ng-repeat really just do enough. So it's very rare that we would write, extremely rare that we would write our own template or structural directives. Okay? So let's look, here's an example of a built-in one. Let's look at an example of one we might write ourselves. Again, I looked long and hard. I actually wrote a business-specific ng-repeat, and it was really just terrible. So these are our categories of Angular 1 directives. Now let's talk about Angular 2. I'm going to use the word directives, but I'm only using that because we're familiar with that term in Angular 1, okay? We're going to quickly abandon this term. In Angular 2, we have two types of directives that we write. The first is a component, okay? And we've seen examples, a ton of examples so far in this conference, and in any other conference that you might write or might have watched in the last 6 months about examples that show you component directives. And how do they look? Or what are they represented by? Just like the component directives in Angular 1, they are represented by an element, and they have a template. Okay? So those are component directives. Let's look at an example. We're seeing this new syntax. We're probably seeing it enough, it's starting to become a little familiar to us. We have the component annotation, and then we have a selector that says when that, what elements that applies to. We have our view, and then we have our class that has all of the workings or the behavior for that component. Okay, the other type of directive, the second type, is called a directive. So this is why I'm going to abandon that category of directives. We really have two things now. We have components and we have directives. And it's an unfortunate naming, I don't know if snafu is the right word, but we used to call all these things directives. They lived under this big hat in Angular 1, and in Angular 2, now we have two entirely separate things. They obviously share a lot of common functionality. In fact, they have the same, they are essentially related in the inheritance hierarchy, but they are two entirely separate things, components and directives, okay? Let's go look at our criteria for directives. They are represented by an attribute, and they have no template, okay? So this is exactly like what we call decorators. So now the question, of course, is, well, why don't we just call them decorators? Why didn't the Angular team decide to call them decorators? Does anybody know the answer to that? Okay. Yes, well, it's really 7. It's Yehuda Katz's fault. That's why. Yehuda Katz had this great idea. Wait, the Angular team wanted these annotations. And we've got these in the code. These are annotations, right? Annotations are just a subtype of this concept that Yehuda Katz came up with called decorators, which is a way to give metadata to your code. Yehuda Katz is a little bit, the decorator concept's a little bit bigger. But we can just think of these as, these are decorators. And it's fine for us to think of these. These are decorators now. So even though we might call them internally in Angular as annotations, these are going to be implemented as decorators in ES7. So ES7 stole our name. We don't get to use decorators anymore. And so the Angular team realized the one thing they did not want to do was give Shai Resnick any more fuel for an ng-wat talk and have a decorator inside of Angular that is decorated by decorators from ES7. So I'm sure that Shai was crying when that happened because he's looking, I'm sure, for his material for his next talk. But, and by the way, if you guys have not seen ng-wat from ngconf, definitely check it out. Hilarious talk. Completely devoid of useful information, but hilarious nonetheless. So these are decorators, which means that this is now a directive. So let's look at an example. Here's our syntax for a directive. We use the directive decorator, or annotation, with a selector. And the weird thing here is the square brackets defines the selector. I didn't make that decision. And then we have our class. Okay? Syntax is very simple. So this is a key component to realize is we have this mapping between Angular 2 and Angular 1 that even though the syntax might look entirely different, we are dealing with essentially the same exact concepts. We have components that were components in Angular 1. We just never called them that, but that's what they were. And then we have directives, which were decorators in Angular 1. Okay? These are the two exact same things. So now you might be wondering, well, what about number 3? What about my structural and template directives? Where are those in Angular 2? Well, those are the asterisk ng4, which was asterisk for, I don't know what they're going to be called next week, but whatever they are. Those still exist, and you can write them on your own, but the Angular team realized that nobody really wrote them on their own. Like, it almost never happens, so why bother with yet another concept that people have to worry about? They're just a very, very, very special type of directive. So we don't even have to worry about it. Our model's gone simple. So back to Angular 1 again. When we built up our application, we really had 4 options when we were building things. We could just do controllers and not even worry about doing our own directives. And then we had component directives, decorator directives, and then structural directives, right? We kind of had these 4 concepts. And we didn't think of them necessarily as 4 different things. We thought of them as 2 things, but they really were 4 different things. Now in Angular 2, we have components and directives. We have 2 things. So already things are getting simpler. The one thing I love personally is that question of, all right, do I break this down by a controller with some subcontrollers, or should I use directives? I don't know. So now it's all simple. The Angular team has made this much simpler because we only have these 2 concepts. And this is the key point I want you guys to walk away from this from this is that these things are just like Angular 1, and it is not going to be hard for us to learn Angular 2. So what I want to do next is show you a little bit of side-by-side examples of some code of Angular 1 and Angular 2 to kind of cement this concept. And this idea was actually done by Patrick Stapleton, who spoke at NG Vegas and gave this great talk. Patrick, where are you? Look, Patrick in the back waving. Everybody wave back at Patrick. This is his idea. I stole it. I'm doing it a lot better, obviously. And what I don't like is that this is not There we go. That's a little bit better. I can take my adrenal pills later. Okay. On the left, we have the HTML for, oh, this is my reminder. See, Patrick, I really did care about giving you props. Okay, this is the HTML for Angular 1 directive, component directive. This is the HTML for an Angular 2 component directive. They do the same exact thing. Look at how similar they are, right? The only thing that's really different is the ng show becomes a binding to hidden. Okay, this is a collapsible address, so it shows an expanded address or a collapsed one, and you can click to toggle the state, right? ng click becomes the click event handler. Like, almost nothing has changed. Let's look at the code. All right, here's the code in Angular 1, and I love the way that Patrick did this. We can see our name, collapsible address, on the top on the left and on the top on the right, both in line 2, the name. Of course, what's nice in Angular 2 is we actually get the actual name that the element's going to be with the dash. We don't have to translate in our mind the camel case to snake case. How many people have gotten screwed by that? There's not enough hands going up. I know that more people have. You guys are embarrassing yourselves. All right, and then we have this restrict E when we return our object. We don't even have to deal with that anymore because we know it's a component. Scope tells us that we're bringing in an address, whereas on line 3, on the right-hand side, properties tell us that we're bringing in an address. Is this big enough for everybody to see? Anybody in the back having a problem? Want to go one more? Is that good? All right. And then our template URL, our controller versus our class, and then inside of the controller versus the class. I should have done this with controller as people will, John Pop is rolling over in his grave right now, is collapsed, we initialize it, and then we just have our functions. Look at how similar those two things are. So, I do have an example of a decorator in both Angular 1 and Angular 2, but it's far less analogous, but that's just because the ways that we do things are extremely different. So stop staring at that. That's distracting. Okay. Angular 1 and Angular 2 are vastly different, yet extremely similar, just like elementary school and middle school. Angular 2 is laid out very logically. It's very easy to learn, and in a couple of days, when it launches, after it launches, not now, it's going to be, you're going to have an easy time going through it and learning it. And but it is really nice to think through that we have these concepts in Angular 1, we have the same thing in Angular 2, and it's just taking what was in Angular 1, wrapping it up in a much neater package so that as authors, as developers, we can write our applications simpler and have an easier time picking up and knowing where to use what piece as we build our Angular 2 applications. So that's what I want you guys to remember, and thank you all for coming.